Sujal, thank you so much for joining us.
Don't clap yet, I haven't said anything. No, I'm good. So I'm glad to be here. I have to admit that I'm both honored and a little bit nervous to be speaking after two people I look up to so much. Dr. Lawrence's comment about his previous mentor was not lost on me. I tried to audit Vince's class when I was a student at Berkeley and made the regrettable decision to take some other courses that semester. And I have to admit that since then I've always wondered what would have been. So I'm going to make a few brief comments geared particularly towards all the students in the audience. And then hopefully we'll be able to have a robust question and answer session. I don't have any slides, so I'll just leave Vince's slides up there. I wanted to start off with kind of why human rights are important. We've heard a lot about the concepts broadly, about what they mean, the terms we might need to use. But I think the way I think about it, at least, is that in most parts of the world, the majority of clinical encounters that physicians have, and I would argue that this holds true in America too, we're treating violations of human rights. It's what we do on a day-to-day basis. It's no less the case in Detroit or in Michigan, where I live, in South Boston or in Appalachia. There's systematic denials of human rights that occur. When we talk about 47 or 50 million people uninsured, tens of millions more underinsured in America. When you talk about systematic rape in Congo, the conflict in Darfur, physicians around the world have a job of just treating human rights. And so what we're trying to do here is to take it a step back, to figure out ways of teaching our fellow colleagues about human rights, about their responsibilities with regards to human rights, and then hopefully as we progress in our careers and as we get older, to figuring out ways that we can stop those sorts of violations occurring. Because I know that all of us would like to do things besides treat human rights violations. And so when I was preparing for this talk, I've read a couple of articles, and there was an editorial by Jennifer Leaney, who's on the PHR board of directors. And she recommended a few years ago that every medical student should get a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights when they enter medical school. I thought it was fascinating. And her argument was that as we progress through medical school, we would be able to link the human rights violations or the human rights abuses or what we see in our clinical encounters to specific parts of actionable items that humans and our fellow humans should be able to expect. So the right to health, the right to food, the right to housing, all of those sorts of things. And so I thought that was fascinating. It was something that kind of struck me and it stayed with me for a while. Vince mentioned a study that he and several students did that same semester, actually. Yeah, I'm still bitter. Where they really looked at, they did a survey of all the deans of schools of public health, of all the schools of medicine, to figure out who was teaching human rights, what they were teaching, and what the barriers were. It turns out that a small proportion of the class of the schools were teaching human rights. Let me get the numbers for you. Let's see, 40% of respondents reported that some form of health and human rights education, which includes an elective or required course or seminar, one or more modules of an elective or required course, or an elective conference, was present at their institution. When you break that down, it was 32% at schools of medicine and 54% at schools of public health. So for the medical students, we do have some catching up to do. And the study, which I think is included in the CD and is definitely available on PHR's website, is really a fascinating read. It's important that I think all of you read that before you approach deans, before you talk to faculty members, because it gives you some evidence as to what they might be thinking, what they might be worried about, funding issues, faculty issues, all that sort of stuff. And so we'll be talking more about that in our various tracks today when we talk about developing clinical electives, when we talk about developing preclinical electives. and conferences and things like that. And I've got 2 minutes, so I was going to speak briefly about the various efforts that different schools have kind of done for health and human rights, VCU, NYU, WashU, but there are experts in this room that have really spearheaded those efforts, and so I'll let them talk to you at their various sessions today. The one thing that I wanted to make sure I mention is that, as Vince mentioned, global health is a new term, and a lot of us are probably also interested in global health as we are interested in health and human rights. And something that we are going to have to figure out and grapple with as we move forward in incorporating health and human rights education into the curriculum is where we stand in relation to this somewhat nebulous term of global health. For example, the Global Health Education Consortium, along with the Association of Faculties of Medicine of Canada, formed a joint committee to figure out core competencies of medical education that should be incorporated for every medical student to learn. So the Krebs cycle of global health, basically. And what we're trying to do is really pare it down and be cognizant of the fact that time is limited in medical school and there are a lot of competing priorities. But I am proud to say that health and human rights is part of those recommendations. And so as we move forward, and hopefully as the LCME adopts the recommendations that we're proposing, health and human rights will become kind of a basic thing that every medical student will be exposed to. But until that day, we have to rely on all of you. And so hopefully throughout today, you will get the tools, you'll make some contacts, and you'll get some information that will help you advance health and human rights education at your respective schools. And so I'm looking forward to kind of learning from all of you today, from speaking to you, to finding out what exactly you guys are doing and what's really going to work at each of your schools, because it's going to be different at each school. And then finally, I just wanted to end by saying that when I've talked to students about incorporating health and human rights into the medical education curriculum, I get a sense of, sometimes I feel a sense of apprehension from the students. Many of you may feel unsure about incorporating health and human rights into the core curriculum. You may worry that not everyone's going to be interested. You might be concerned about competing with other important courses, such as global health, health disparities, things like that. These feelings, I think, are understandable. But I encourage you, as you're thinking about these issues, to challenge us at PHR, to challenge yourselves and to challenge your faculty members to figure out exactly why health and human rights might be necessary, and the substantive effects that incorporating health and human rights education into the medical curriculum will have on patient outcomes, which is the ultimate goal. Personally, I think that doing so will have a profound impact, both in terms of immediate patient outcomes and longer-term health disparities. But we shouldn't be timid. Our apprehension shouldn't lead to timidity. We shouldn't have to negotiate, we don't have to negotiate about whether or not we need to learn pathology, whether or not we need to learn pharmacology. Health and human rights is no less important. What we seek to do when we talk about these issues is address social pathologies using social, political, legal, and educational therapeutic regimens. So we shouldn't have to haggle over the scraps of curriculum left to issues of cultural competence, global health, and human rights. Human rights itself should be a core competency, not because PHR happens to be interested or because our governments are bound to respect these principles, but because we, as patients, rightly expect respect for and protection of human rights and human dignity as the foundation of any clinical encounter and any medical practice. The current medical education system doesn't teach that, it doesn't address it, and we are here to say that it's no longer acceptable.